Good day, dear listener. Pull up a comfortable chair, pour yourself a cup of tea, and allow me to whisk you away to the sleepy English village of St. Mary Mead, where nothing is ever quite as peaceful as it seems. You are about to spend a most agreeable few hours in the company of a certain elderly lady whose knitting needles are as sharp as her mind. Welcome to Miss Marple and the Calculated Crime. Chapter 1. The Ledger That Lied. The afternoon of Tuesday, the 17th of September, 1951, was one of those perfect late summer days that seem designed to remind the English that their climate is not, after all, entirely spiteful. A soft golden light lay over St. Mary Mead like warm honey. The horse chestnuts along the high street had begun to turn, and every garden gate appeared to wear a little bouquet of Michaelmas daisies tied with invisible ribbon. Even the rooks in the vicarage elms sounded almost cheerful. In the small, neat house called Dame Mead, Miss Jane Marple sat beside the window in her favorite chintz-covered armchair, knitting. The needles moved with the calm precision of long practice, turning a ball of pale blue four-ply into something delicate and intricate that would, in due course, become a layette for the expected grandchild of her great niece. A little tabby cat named Alexander the Great lay curled on the footstool, one paw tucked neatly beneath his chest, dreaming whatever dignified dreams cats dream when the sun is warm and the world orderly. Across the narrow lane, the postman, Mr. Petherick, could be heard exchanging pleasantries with Mrs. Bantry about the proper training of sweet peas up bamboo canes. Their voices drifted in through the open casement on air that smelled faintly of wood smoke and freshly baked Victoria sponge. All was, in short, exactly as it ought to be. Until the church clock struck 4. The sound had barely died away when the peace was shattered by the hurried clack of heels on the pavement and the appearance at Miss Marple's gate of young Mrs. Harmon, the vicar's wife, hat askew and cheeks scarlet with excitement. Miss Marple, oh, Miss Marple, such dreadful news, Mr. Harbottle, he's dead. Miss Marple laid her knitting carefully in her lap. Dead? She repeated in the mild tone she might have used for an unexpected shower of rain. Poor Mr. Harbottle. His heart, I suppose. That's just it. Mrs. Harmon pressed both gloved hands to her bosom as though to still its fluttering. They're saying poison, digitalis, enough to kill a regiment, and the ledger open on his desk with a great red circle round Mrs. Proctor's £27,000. Mrs. Pauk found him not half an hour ago, slumped forward with his pen still in his hand. Oh, it's too shocking. Miss Marple regarded her visitor with bright, bird-like eyes. Come inside, my dear, and sit down before you fall down. A cup of tea will do us both good. While the kettle sang on the hob and Mrs. Harmon recovered, herself on the sofa, the news traveled through the village with the speed and thoroughness of a well-organized fire brigade. By 4:30, half of St. Mary Mead knew that Mr. Reginald Harbottle, senior partner of Harbottle, Finch and Wren, solicitors, had been foully done to death in his own office. By 5 o'clock, the other half had been brought up to date by telephone, garden wall, or the simple expedient of standing in the doorway and shouting across the street. Miss Marple, having soothed Mrs. Harmon with Earl Grey and a slice of seed cake, put on her second-best hat, straw with a modest bunch of violets, and set out for the scene of the tragedy. She walked at the gentle pace suitable to a lady of advanced years, who nevertheless intended to arrive before anything interesting had been tidied away. The offices of Harbottle, Finch and Wren stood at the quieter end of the high street, a pleasant red brick Georgian house with white-painted windows and a brass plate polished to solar brilliance. A small knot of villagers hovered outside, murmuring like bees round a particularly scandalous hive. Constable Polk, very upright and self-important, stood guard at the door. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, touching his helmet. "Terrible business. Doctor's with him now, and young Mr. Wren's in a proper state." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple murmured, and slipped past before the constable could decide whether or not she ought to be admitted. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax, old paper, and something faintly, sweetly medicinal that made her nostrils prickle. The passage was dim and cool after the sunshine. From the room at the back, the senior partner's sanctum, came the low rumble of men's voices. Dr. Haydock emerged just as Miss Marple reached the half-open door. He was a large, kindly, untidy man with a mop of graying hair and the abstracted air of one who has been interrupted in the middle of something fascinating. "Ah, Miss Marple." He closed the door carefully behind him. "I might have known you'd appear." "Old habits, doctor dear. How is poor Mr. Harbottle?" "Extremely dead, I'm afraid. Massive dose of digitalis, far more than his heart could stand. Taken in the last hour or two, I should say." "In his tea, perhaps?" Haydock gave her a sharp glance. "The cup on the desk is almost empty. We shall have to wait for analysis, of course, but the symptoms are unmistakable. Bitter almond smell on the breath, pupils dilated. Classic." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And the ledger? Open at the Proctor estate account. Someone drew a perfect circle in red ink round the final disbursement, £27,000 to Miss Clarissa Proctor, and underneath, in Harbottle's own hand, the words, 'They think me a fool. I know.'" He ushered her into the room. The study was exactly as one expected a solicitor's room to be. Dark oak furniture, rows of deed boxes labeled in copperplate, a turkey carpet worn thin by generations of anxious feet. Mr. Harbottle himself sat, or rather slumped, at the great mahogany desk, head fallen forward onto folded arms as though asleep over his work. His spectacles had slipped to the end of his nose. A fountain pen lay where it had dropped from lifeless fingers, leaving a small blue comma on the blotting paper. The ledger lay open beneath his right hand. Miss Marple bent to examine it, careful not to touch. The page was headed "Estate of the late Mrs. Emmeline Proctor, deceased 14th June last." The entries were beautifully neat, the final line showing a balance of $27,000 to be paid to Miss Clarissa Proctor upon probate. Around the figure a thick circle had been drawn in red ink, the pressure of the pen so fierce that it had scored the paper. Beneath, in Mr. Harbottle's crabbed but unmistakable script, the accusing sentence. On the silver tray at his elbow stood a Wedgwood cup and saucer, the tea leaves dark and sodden at the bottom. Beside it, a plate bearing the remains of 2 arrowroot biscuits. Miss Marple's gaze traveled round the room. The clock on the mantel, a handsome walnut-cased affair with a loud tick, showed 20 minutes past 4. The curtains were half drawn against the afternoon sun, giving the scene a muted, almost underwater light. On the hearthrug lay a single petal, pale, spotted purple. Foxglove, Timothy Wren, the junior partner, stood by the window twisting a handkerchief into knots. He was a thin, fair young man of perhaps 30, with the anxious eyes of one who has never quite believed good fortune will last. "Miss Marple," he said, voice cracking, "I can't understand it. We locked up together at 1 o'clock for lunch. He was perfectly well then. I went to the golf club for a quick 9 holes, came back just after 4 and found this." "You didn't hear the clock strike 4?" she asked gently. He shook his head. "I came in through the garden door at the back. It leads straight into my own room. I never passed this door until Mrs. Polk started screaming." Mrs. Polk herself was in the kitchen, being comforted by the daily help with repeated cups of strong tea and the information that it might very well have been her. Miss Marple drifted to the window. The garden beyond was a charming wilderness of old roses and herbaceous borders. Against the far wall grew a stately row of foxgloves, their bells already browning but the lower leaves recently stripped. A narrow gravel path led from the French window directly to a small wooden door in the wall, standing ajar. She turned back to the desk. In the waste paper basket lay a crumpled ball of paper. With the tip of her umbrella, she fished it out and smoothed it on the blotter. It was a letter written on heavy cream stock. My dear Mr. Harbottle, thank you so much for your kindness this afternoon. It is a great relief to know everything is now in order. Yours very sincerely, Clarissa Proctor. The writing was elegant, sloping, very much the hand of a young lady who had been expensively educated. Yet something about it struck Miss Marple as not quite right. Dr. Haydock raised an eyebrow. Miss Proctor was here? Apparently, said Miss Marple, though whether she wrote this particular note is another matter. Timothy Wren looked utterly bewildered. Clarissa Proctor hasn't been near the office for weeks. Mr. Harbottle was furious with her. She kept telephoning about advancing money before probate. He told her yesterday that if she rang once more, he'd report her to the Law Society. Miss Marple folded the letter again with delicate precision and returned it to the basket. Outside in the lane, the church clock struck the quarter. Somewhere a blackbird began to sing as though nothing in the least out of the ordinary had occurred. Miss Marple stood very still in the quiet room, her small gloved hands clasped upon her umbrella. £27,000, a forged letter, a clock that might or might not be telling the truth, and a cup of tea that had contained death. Human nature, she reflected, was very much like knitting. What appeared to be a smooth and innocent surface nearly always concealed a carefully placed knot or two. One had only to observe where the pattern changed. She smiled a small, determined smile. The game, as they say, was afoot. And in St. Mary Mead, when Miss Jane Marple began to take an interest, murderers would do well to tremble behind their net curtains. Chapter 2. Tea and Suspects. The following afternoon dawned bright and crisp with a touch of autumn chill that made the villagers reach for their woolen cardigans and mutter about the shortening days. St. Mary Mead, however, was far too preoccupied with the previous day's tragedy to dwell on the weather. Whispers flew from cottage to cottage like leaves in a brisk wind. Poison in the tea, a cryptic message in the ledger, and poor Mr. Harbottle, who had always seemed so indestructible behind his spectacles and stacks of legal documents. By lunchtime, the High Street tea shop was doing a roaring trade in scones and speculation, and more than one pair of eyes turned toward Dane Mead, wondering what Miss Jane Marple made of it all. It was Mrs. Dolly Bantry who took charge, as she so often did in times of village upheaval. Gossington Hall, her rambling Georgian pile on the edge of St. Mary Mead, was the natural venue for what she grandly termed a council of war. Invitations, scrawled on her best notepaper and delivered by her gardener's boy on his bicycle, went out to a select few. The vicar and his wife, Dr. Haydock, young Mr. Wren from the firm, and of course Miss Marple herself. "We must pool our resources," Mrs. Bantry declared over the telephone to anyone who demurred. "It's positively our duty, and there will be cucumber sandwiches." Miss Marple arrived promptly at 3 o'clock, stepping lightly from the lane in her dove gray wool coat and a sensible hat adorned with a single velvet violet. She carried a small black reticule that contained, among other things, a half-finished knitting project and a notebook disguised as a prayer book. The gravel drive crunched pleasantly under her feet as she approached the hall's imposing front door, where Bunch Harmon, Mrs. Harmon to the village, greeted her with a fluttery embrace. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it dreadful? Poison in St. Mary Mead. I keep thinking of that poor man alone in his office, sipping his doom from a Wedgwood cup." "Quite dreadful, my dear," Miss Marple agreed mildly, allowing herself to be ushered into the drawing-room. "Though one must remember that digitalis is not always administered with malice. Accidents do happen." The drawing-room was a vision of faded grandeur. Chintz sofas sagging comfortably under the weight of plump cushions, a grand piano littered with family photographs in silver frames, and a fire crackling merrily in the grate despite the mild day. Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in a tweed suit and pearls the size of marbles, held court from an armchair by the window. Around her sat the assembled company, balancing teacups and looking suitably grave. Dr. Haydock was there, his large frame wedged into a spindly chair that creaked protestingly. Beside him, the vicar, Leonard Clement, polished his spectacles with a silk handkerchief while his wife fussed over the tea tray. Timothy Wren perched on the edge of a footstool, his fair hair disheveled and his tie slightly askew as though grief had robbed him of his usual neatness. And completing the circle were the uninvited but inevitable: Sergeant Lake from the local constabulary, notebook at the ready, and Miss Clarissa Proctor herself, who had arrived unannounced with the air of a tragic heroine in a West End play. Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands for attention as Miss Marple settled into a vacant seat. "Now that we're all here, thank you for coming so promptly, Miss Marple. Let us get down to brass tacks. Reginald Harbottle was murdered, and in the most calculated fashion. Digitalis in his tea, the doctor says, and that ledger open at the Proctor estate with its accusing scrawl. Someone wanted that £27,000 very badly indeed." Clarissa Proctor, tall and elegant in a tailored black dress that accentuated her pale complexion and dark hair, drew in a sharp breath. "Aunt Emmeline's money? But that's absurd. Mr. Harbottle himself drew up the will. I was there when she signed it. If anyone thinks I—" She broke off, pressing a lace handkerchief to her lips. "No one's accusing anyone, my dear," Mrs. Bantry said briskly, though her eyes sparkled with the thrill of it all. "But facts are facts. You are the chief beneficiary, and it's well known you've had financial embarrassments. That theatrical venture of yours, Moon Over Miami, wasn't it? I heard the producer absconded to South America with the takings." Clarissa flushed. "A temporary setback. But I would never—" "Of course not," interjected the vicar soothingly. "Though temptation can be a terrible thing, as it says in Proverbs." Mrs. Bantry cut him off with a wave of her teacup. "Proverbs later, Leonard. Let's list the suspects properly as they do in detective novels. I've been reading that new one by Miss Christie. Most instructive." Miss Marple sipped her Darjeeling, her bright eyes moving from face to face like a bird spotting seeds. "People will murder for far less than £27,000, Dolly dear," she murmured, though rarely with quite such arithmetic precision. "A circle in red ink, almost like a schoolmaster marking an error." The room fell silent for a moment, save for the tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. Then Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. "Well, if we're playing at detectives, there are others with motives. Captain Roger Emmett, for one, Mrs. Proctor's godson. Retired from the Indian Army with a limp and a taste for the GGs. He's been borrowing against his expectations for months. Harbottle turned him down flat for an advance last week." "Captain Emmett?" Bunch Harmon's eyes widened. "But he's such a charming man. Always so polite at the church fete." "Charming men have debts too," said Sergeant Lake gruffly, flipping a page in his notebook. "And then there's Mrs. Lavinia Cross, the companion. 15 years of service, and all she got was £500 and a mourning brooch. She was heard arguing with Harbottle about irregularities in the housekeeping accounts." Mrs. Bantry nodded vigorously. "Yes, Lavinia, poor thing, always looks so downtrodden. And what about you, Mr. Wren? No offense, but you and Harbottle had that fearful row in the office last Tuesday." Mrs. Polk heard every word. Something about missing files? Timothy Wren went pale, his hands twisting in his lap. "It was nothing. A misunderstanding over a client matter. Mr. Harbottle could be exacting. But murder? Good heavens, no. And finally," Dr. Haydock added, "there's young Nurse Dane. Gloria, isn't it? Dr. Hayden's new assistant. Dazzling girl, 23, all blonde curls and dimples. Rumor has it Harbottle was showering her with gifts. A pearl necklace, a fur stole, most improper for a man of his age. Clarissa Proctor snorted delicately. Gifts to a nurse? That doesn't sound like the skinflint I knew. Jealousy, perhaps, suggested Mrs. Bantry with relish. Or blackmail. Oh, this is better than any novel. Miss Marple set down her cup with a soft clink. Human nature is rarely as dramatic as fiction, Dolly, but it does have its patterns. A desperate heiress, an indebted soldier, a slighted companion, a quarrelsome partner, a favored young woman, each with a thread leading back to that ledger. And the digitalis, of course, such a convenient poison derived from the common foxglove. One sees them in every garden this time of year. The group exchanged glances, the atmosphere thickening, like cream in a jug. Sergeant Lake cleared his throat. If you'll excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, I must report back to the inspector, but if any of you recall anything at all. As he departed, the conversation fragmented into smaller knots. The vicar murmuring platitudes to Clarissa, Dr. Haydock discussing toxicology with Mr. Wren, Mrs. Bantry pressing more sandwiches on Bunch. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting needles clicking a steady rhythm. She watched and listened and filed away the little inconsistencies. Clarissa's too perfect poise, Wren's trembling fingers, the way Dr. Haydock avoided mentioning the exact time of death. By 4:30, the gathering began to disperse, promises of further updates exchanged amid hats and coats. Miss Marple walked home slowly, the late sun casting long shadows across the lane. St. Mary Mead looked as peaceful as ever, with smoke curling from chimneys and children playing hopscotch on the pavement. But beneath the surface, she knew, currents ran deep and dark. Tea and suspects, she reflected. The perfect brew for unraveling a mystery. And somewhere in that drawing room, a clue had already been dropped, like a stitch in her knitting waiting to be picked up. Chapter 3. The Garden That Remembered. The morning after Mrs. Bantry's tea party broke cool and pearl gray, with a thin mist drifting off the fields and curling round the church tower like a conspiratorial scarf. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, fed Alexander the Great a saucer of milk, and then wrapped herself in a warm shawl the color of heather. She had decided upon a gentle constitutional. In her experience, nothing loosened tongues or revealed secrets quite so effectively as a leisurely walk taken at the hour when daily women were shaking mats and gardeners were burning autumn rubbish. She set out along the high street, nodding to Mrs. Baker outside the baker's, exchanging a word with old Mr. Huggins, who was sweeping his step with great solemnity, and pausing to admire the display of Cox's orange pippins in the greengrocer's window. No one seeing the small, silver-haired lady in her sensible lace-up shoes would have guessed that she was engaged upon anything more serious than choosing apples. Her route, however, was deliberate. She turned down the little passage beside the Blue Boar, crossed the stile into the footpath that skirted the backs of the houses, and presently found herself looking over a low brick wall into the walled garden of Harbottle, Finch, and Wren. The garden was one of the prettiest in the village, though sadly neglected since old Mr. Finch died and Mr. Harbottle declared that herbaceous borders were an extravagance. Nevertheless, the Michaelmas daisies still blazed purple and white, and against the far wall stood a magnificent row of foxgloves, tall spires of speckled bells now going to seed, but the lower leaves stripped almost bare. Miss Marple rested her gloved hands on the coping and surveyed the scene with quiet satisfaction. There is nothing, she reflected, so informative as a garden. Plants, unlike people, cannot lie. The wooden door in the wall, the one that opened directly onto the lane, stood ajar. Through it came the sound of vigorous scrubbing and the faint, comforting smell of sunlight soap. Mrs. Polk, the daily, was on her knees giving the York stone path a proper seeing to. "Good morning, Mrs. Polk," Miss Marple called softly. Mrs. Polk sat back on her heels, red-faced and formidable. Morning, miss. Proper upset I am. Can't seem to settle to anything. To think I was in that very room not 2 hours before, and him sitting there large as life grumbling about the price of coal? You mustn't blame yourself, my dear. Tell me, did Mr. Harbottle take tea every afternoon? Like clockwork, miss. 3:30 on the dot. I'd bring in the tray myself. Brown Betty teapot, 2 arrowroot biscuits on a plate, and the cup and saucer with the little pink rose. Yesterday I was late. My sister's youngest had the colic, so I left the tray ready on the sideboard in the kitchen at 3 o'clock and told him to help himself. When I came back at 4:30 to collect it, well, she shuddered dramatically. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. And the foxgloves? Such handsome plants. I noticed the lower leaves have been taken. Mrs. Polk snorted. That'd be Nurse Dane, always poking about out here, picking this and that. Said she was drying things for potpourri, at her age. Mind you, she's a taking little piece. Blonde curls and a smile that'd charm the birds off the trees. No wonder the old gentleman was sweet on her. Mr. Harbottle. And others beside, Mrs. Polk said darkly. Captain Emmett was round here only last week asking to see the garden, said he missed his roses in India, roses indeed. He spent more time looking at Nurse Dane hanging out her stockings than at any flower. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the stripped foxglove stems. Digitalis purpurea, she murmured. The leaves are strongest in the second year. One must be so careful with the dosage. Mrs. Polk gave her a sharp glance. You don't think she... I think nothing yet, Miss Marple said serenely. But gardens remember everything, Mrs. Polk, every footprint, every dropped petal, even the ashes in the kitchen stove. Mrs. Polk's jaw dropped. How did you know about the ashes? I found a whole handful of withered leaves when I riddled the grate this morning. Burnt, but not burnt enough. Funny bitter smell they gave off. I was going to mention it to the police, only you thought they might not listen to a daily woman, Miss Marple finished gently. Never underestimate daily women, my dear. We see a great deal more than we are given credit for. She bade Mrs. Polk good day and continued her walk, turning at last into the lane that led past the vicarage. There, in the neat border beneath the study window, grew another fine stand of foxgloves. The vicar's wife was fond of cottage garden plants. Miss Marple paused again. These too had been stripped of their lower leaves, though more neatly, almost professionally. On the gravel path lay a single discarded petal, pale lilac spotted with crimson, exactly matching the one she had noticed on Mr. Harbottle's hearthrug the previous day. Miss Marple bent stiffly and picked it up, tucking it into her glove. A tiny thing, but evidence does not come much plainer. She was still standing there, considering the implications, when a cheerful voice hailed her. Morning, Miss Marple. Admiring our foxgloves? Bunch is terribly proud of them. The vicar, tall, untidy, and perpetually good-humored, came round the corner carrying a basket of windfall apples. They are splendid, Miss Marple agreed, though I fear someone has been helping themselves to the leaves. Really? The vicar looked vaguely about. Bunch did say something about Nurse Dane asking permission to take a few for drying. Said it was for some Women's Institute demonstration. Perfectly harmless, I dare say. Perfectly, Miss Marple echoed, but her eyes were thoughtful. By the time she reached home again, the sun had burned away the mist and St. Mary Mead sparkled innocently under a washed blue sky. Alexander the Great greeted her with dignified reproach for the lateness of his elevenses. Miss Marple removed her hat, filled the kettle, and sat down at the little table by the window to consider what she had learned. A tray prepared at 3 o'clock and left unattended for half an hour. A garden door standing open. Stripped foxgloves in 2 separate gardens and burnt leaves in a stove. a pretty young nurse who collected plants and received expensive gifts, and a single foxglove petal carried indoors on a shoe, perhaps, or the hem of a uniform. She opened her notebook, the one disguised as a prayer book, and wrote in her neat, slanting hand, Nurse Dane, opportunity, knowledge, motive. Then underneath she added another line. But why the red circle in the ledger? That feels theatrical. Miss Marple closed the book and looked out at the peaceful village street. Somewhere a dog barked, somewhere else a woman called to a child, all so ordinary, so safe. And yet a man had drunk death in a cup of tea not 24 hours earlier. She reached for her knitting. The needles began their soft, steady click. Patterns, she thought. Everything in life was a pattern. One had only to observe long enough and carefully enough for the dropped stitches to reveal themselves. Chapter 4. The Alibi Clock. On Thursday morning, the village awoke to the sound of rain, a soft, steady September drizzle that turned the high street into a ribbon of polished slate and filled every gutter with a gentle whispering. Miss Marple, who regarded rain as nature's way of encouraging people to stay indoors and talk, was not displeased. She finished her breakfast toast, settled Alexander the Great on the cushion by the fire, and telephoned Gossington Hall to inquire whether Colonel Bantry had yet returned from his fishing trip in Scotland. He had not, which was all to the good. Mrs. Bantry's drawing room was far too comfortable for the sort of conversation she had in mind. At 10:30, a large black Humber deposited Inspector Dermot Craddock on her doorstep. He was tall, dark, impeccably turned out, and possessed of the particular brand of courtesy that made even the most formidable village ladies feel they were helping Scotland Yard rather than being interrogated by it. "Aunt Jane," he greeted her, using the honorary title he had bestowed years earlier. "I have been warned that if anything is happening in St. Mary Mead, you will already know most of it. Come in out of the wet, Dermot dear, and have a cup of coffee. Real coffee, not that camp stuff you pretend to like." He laughed and followed her inside. 10 minutes later, they were established on either side of the fire, a plate of shortbread between them, and the inspector's notebook open on his knee. "Poison is a woman's weapon," he began, stirring sugar with unnecessary violence. Miss Marple poured a second cup. "Statistically, perhaps, though men have been known to use it when they wish to avoid mess or noise. Tell me, have you examined the clock in Mr. Harbottle's study?" Craddock looked up sharply. "Walnut-cased mantel clock stopped at 4:20. Hands appear to have been moved deliberately. There are faint scratches on the glass." "Exactly 4:20, Miss Marple repeated. "Yet Mrs. Polk is prepared to swear she heard it strike 5, not 10 minutes before she discovered the body. Curious, don't you think?" The inspector's eyes narrowed. "You believe the clock was put forward?" "I believe someone wished us to think Mr. Harbottle was alive at 4:20. In fact, Dr. Haydock's preliminary examination suggests death occurred closer to 3:20. That gives our murderer a comfortable margin." Craddock made a note. "Alibis for 3 o'clock onward, then. We have been checking from 4. That alters everything." Miss Marple offered him another piece of shortbread. "It does indeed. Now let us consider who benefits from the later time." She rose and fetched a sheet of writing paper, ruling it neatly into columns with her silver propelling pencil. "Captain Emmett, drinking with 3 other men at the Goat and Compasses from 3 o'clock. The barmaid is prepared to swear to it because he insisted on paying for a round with a bad £5 note, and they had words. Miss Clarissa Proctor trying on hats at Madame Louise in Much Benham. The assistant remembers the exact time because Clarissa knocked over an entire stand of berets and spent 20 minutes apologizing. Mrs. Lavinia, cross, taking tea with the vicar's wife from 2:30 until 5. They were addressing envelopes for the Save the Children Fund and have the ink stains to prove it. Mr. Timothy Wren, playing bridge at the golf club from 2:30. His partner is Mrs. Price Ridley, who never forgets a revoke. And Nurse Gloria Dane. Miss Marple paused. Nurse Dane requested the entire afternoon off to visit a sick aunt in Lower Benham. The aunt, alas, is in robust health and has not laid eyes on her niece for 6 months. Craddock whistled softly. So the nurse has no alibi at all for the crucial time. None whatever, Miss Marple agreed. Though absence of alibi is not proof of guilt, merely of opportunity. The inspector tapped his pencil against his teeth. Motive? Harbottle was 72. Hardly a crime of passion. Yet he had been giving her expensive presents, pearls, a fur cape, a deposit of £500 into an account at the Westminster Bank. Sergeant Lake discovered that yesterday. And there is the matter of the foxglove leaves in the kitchen stove. Craddock closed his notebook with a snap. We shall have to bring her in for questioning. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his sleeve. Wait a little, Dermot. There is something that troubles me. The red circle in the ledger, the torn letter in the wastepaper basket, those feel almost staged, as though someone wished to draw attention to the Proctor will. Why? To cast suspicion on Clarissa Proctor, obviously. Or to cast suspicion away from the real murderer, Miss Marple said softly. The rain had eased to a misty drizzle. Through the window they could see the postman hurrying past with his cape glistening. One more thing, Miss Marple continued. Mrs. Polk tells me that on the morning of the murder she found a small thermos flask in the cupboard under the stairs. Silver monogram GD. It was not there the day before. Gloria Dane, Craddock said grimly. Presumably. Though why bring one's own tea when perfectly good tea is provided? Unless, of course, one wished to be quite certain what went into the cup. The inspector stood up. I must speak to the nurse at once. Will you come with me, Aunt Jane? You have a way of making people tell the truth without realizing they are doing it. Miss Marple considered. Perhaps later. First, I should like to pay a call on Dr. Haydock. There is a small point about digitalis dosage I need clarified. Craddock smiled. You mean you wish to be sure the poison really was in the tea and not administered some other way? Precisely. One must be thorough. The inspector departed, splashing through the puddles with renewed energy. Miss Marple watched him go, then reached for her umbrella and a warm scarf. 10 minutes later, she was tapping briskly at the surgery door in the High Street. Dr. Haydock received her in his consulting room, which smelled of iodine and wet Macintoshes. Digitalis, he said without preamble, having clearly been expecting the question. The concentration in the dregs of that cup was enormous, far more than could be explained by an accidental overdose of his tablets. Someone distilled a tincture from fresh leaves and added it to the tea. A matter of minutes to prepare, if one knows how. And the symptoms would appear how quickly? 10 to 20 minutes for the fatal arrhythmia to begin. He would have felt nauseated, seen flashing lights, then the heart simply stopped. Miss Marple nodded. So if the tea was poured at 3 o'clock, death would occur between 3:15 and 3:25. The clock was then moved on 1 hour and 40 minutes to provide an alibi, or several alibis. Exactly. Haydock looked at her with reluctant admiration. You ought to be in the force, Miss Marple. I prefer to remain an interested amateur, she said demurely. Though I do find human nature so much more rewarding than fingerprints. She left the surgery and stood for a moment under the dripping awning, watching the village go about its damp business. Somewhere in this quiet place a murderer walked secure behind a perfect absence of alibi, or perhaps behind an alibi too perfect to be true. The rain had almost stopped. A watery sun glimmered on the wet pavement, turning every puddle into a mirror. Miss Marple opened her umbrella and set off toward home. The clock, she reflected, had been the key all along. Once one accepted that it lied, everything else fell into place, or very nearly. But not quite. There was still the small matter of why Mr. Harbottle had written, "They think me a fool, I know," in the margin of his ledger. That, she suspected, was the knot that would unravel the whole skein. Chapter 5. The letter not posted Friday brought a brisk wind that sent the last of the summer leaves skittering along the lanes like startled chickens. Miss Marple spent the morning peacefully enough. She wrote letters, darned the heel of a lisle stocking, and allowed Alexander the Great to sit on the warm lid of the airing cupboard while she turned out the linen cupboard. Yet all the while her mind was busy with the picture of a stopped clock, a circle in red ink, and a silver thermos bearing the initials GD. At 2:30 the peace was shattered by the ringing of the front door bell, followed by a positive tattoo of knocks. Miss Marple opened to find Clarissa Proctor on the step, hat askew, eyes blazing, and cheeks whipped scarlet by wind and indignation. "Miss Marple, I must speak to you. It's intolerable. They are saying the most dreadful things." "Do come in, my dear," Miss Marple said calmly, as though young women in fur coats and near hysteria arrived on her doorstep every day. "Take off your hat and sit by the fire. A cup of tea will do wonders." Clarissa flung the hat, a dramatic confection of black velvet and a single, sweeping plume, onto the hall stand and swept into the sitting room. "I didn't kill him," she announced, sinking into the best armchair with theatrical finality. "Though heaven knows I needed the money. That wretched producer has vanished to Buenos Aires with every penny of the backing for Moon over Miami. I'm absolutely on the rocks. But poison in tea? I wouldn't know how to begin." Miss Marple poured tea with unruffled grace. "No one who knows you could imagine you poisoning anyone, dear. You are far too direct. If you wished Mr. Harbottle out of the way, you would have struck him with the coal scuttle." Clarissa gave a watery laugh. "I might have done. He telephoned me the very afternoon he died. Said he must see me urgently about Aunt Emmeline's will. I was to come to the office at 4 o'clock precisely. I arrived at 10 past, late because the bus was held up by a herd of cows, and the door was locked. I knocked and knocked. No answer. I thought he had gone out in a temper." Miss Marple handed her a slice of Madeira cake. "And you did not go in?" "How could I? The garden door is kept bolted from the inside during office hours." I went away again, furious. And now the police have found a letter purporting to be from me thanking him for his kindness that afternoon. I never wrote any such letter. "Yet it was on your stationery," Miss Marple said gently. "Cream-laid paper with a tiny crest of a unicorn. Quite distinctive." Clarissa stared. "My stationery? Then someone stole it. I keep it in the left-hand drawer of the bureau at Aunt's house. My house now, I suppose. Anyone could have taken a sheet." "Anyone who knew where to look," Miss Marple agreed. "Tell me, who has been staying with you since your aunt's death?" "Only Mrs. Cross for the first week. She was packing her things. And Captain Emmett dropped in once or twice on what he called a cousinly visit. And Nurse Dane came several times to collect Aunt Emmeline's medical cards." "She was very efficient." Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. "Nurse Dane again. She seems to appear in many places." Clarissa leaned forward, eyes bright with unshed tears. "There is something else. The day after the funeral, Mr. Harbottle asked me to sign some document about probate. I was in a hurry to catch the London train, so I signed without reading it properly. Suppose it was something dreadful, such as an admission that the will was forged?" Miss Marple suggested mildly. Clarissa went white. "You don't think—" "I think nothing yet, but documents can be dangerous things." At that moment the door opened to admit Inspector Craddock, raindrops still clinging to his dark hair. Miss Proctor, he said gravely, I was hoping to find you here. May I see the handbag you carried on the afternoon of the 17th? Clarissa opened her eyes wide. My handbag? Whatever for? A routine matter. He smiled disarmingly. With ill grace, she opened the large patent leather bag and tipped the contents onto the table. Lipstick, compact, a handkerchief scented with L'Heure Bleue, a small purse, and a single sheet of cream-laid paper folded twice. Craddock unfolded it carefully. It was a letter in Clarissa's own handwriting, dated the 17th. My dear Mr. Harbottle, thank you so much for your kindness this afternoon. It is a great relief to know everything is now in order. Yours very sincerely, Clarissa Proctor. Clarissa stared at it as though it were a snake. I did not write that. I did not. Then how does it come to be in your possession? Craddock asked quietly. I don't know. Someone must have put it there. Miss Marple picked up the letter and held it to the light. The paper is yours, certainly. The handwriting is remarkably similar, yet not quite identical. Observe the capital C in your name, Miss Proctor. On the genuine letter you loop the tail. Here it is straight. A clever forgery, but a forgery nevertheless. Craddock's eyes gleamed. Then the letter found torn in the waste-paper basket was planted to incriminate you. Exactly, Miss Marple said, and this second copy was placed in your handbag to be discovered when you were searched. Someone is very anxious indeed that you should appear guilty. Clarissa began to cry in earnest. But who would do such a thing? Miss Marple patted her hand. Someone who profits if you are convicted, my dear. Someone who perhaps profits even more if the will is proved a forgery after all. Craddock looked grim. We have been assuming the murderer wished the will to stand. But suppose the opposite. Suppose Mr. Harbottle had discovered it was forged and was about to expose the forger. £27,000 is a fortune, but prison or the hangman's rope is a greater deterrent. Clarissa dried her eyes. Then the real beneficiary is... That, said Miss Marple, is what we must discover. But first, Inspector, I should like to pay a quiet visit to the post office. Letters that are never posted can be almost as revealing as letters that are. Half an hour later, in the little room behind the post office that smelled of sealing wax and peppermint bull's-eyes, Miss Hartnell, the postmistress, was happy to confirm that no letter addressed to Mr. Harbottle had been handed in by Miss Proctor on the 17th, or indeed on any recent date. Though, she added, lowering her voice conspiratorially, Nurse Dane did buy a twopenny stamp that afternoon. Green coat she was wearing and a little green hat with a feather. Said she had to catch the post. Miss Marple thanked her and stepped back into the windy street. The pieces, she thought, were beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern. A forged letter that was never posted. A second copy planted like a poisoned seed. A young woman in a green coat buying a stamp she did not need. And somewhere in the background the soft, deadly ticking of a clock that had been made to lie. She walked home slowly, the wind tugging at her coat. Human wickedness, she reflected, was always so disappointingly ingenious. Yet ingenuity carried too far invariably betrayed itself. Like a knitter who pulled the wool too tight and split the stitch. Chapter 6. The nurse's day off. Saturday broke clear and blustery with high scudding clouds and a wind that smelled of wood smoke and distant sea. Miss Marple, having slept remarkably well for a lady who had spent half the night thinking about forged letters and stopped clocks, rose at her usual hour, fed Alexander the Great a portion of haddock, and then put on her sturdiest walking shoes and a wool coat the color of ripe damsons. She had an errand that could not wait for the convenience of buses or the goodwill of neighbors with motor cars. By 9 o'clock she was seated in the little branch-line train that pottered between St. Mary Mead and Much Benham, knitting placidly while the carriage rocked and the telegraph wires dipped and rose like a musical score outside the window. At Much Benham, she changed to a country omnibus that smelled of dogs and damp Macintoshes, and by 10 she was standing outside a neat red brick villa in a quiet road where laurel hedges grew thick and glossy. Mrs. Dane, Nurse Gloria Dane's mother, opened the door herself. She was a faded, pretty woman in her late 40s with the same fair curls as her daughter, though now touched with gray, and the same wide blue eyes, though hers carried the permanent anxiety of one who has never quite believed in good fortune. Miss Marple? From St. Mary Mead? She looked puzzled but not displeased. Gloria did mention you. Said you were a dear old thing who noticed everything. Miss Marple accepted the description with equanimity and stepped inside. The villa was spotless, the sort of house where cushions were plumped and photographs dusted daily. A silver-framed portrait of Gloria in her nurse's uniform smiled serenely from the mantelpiece. I have come about the afternoon of the 17th, Miss Marple began, settling into a chair covered in cretonne roses. Gloria told Dr. Haydock she was visiting a sick aunt that day. Yet there seems to be some confusion. Mrs. Dane's hand fluttered to her throat. Aunt? Oh dear. Gloria has no aunt in Lower Benham. She has no aunt anywhere nearer than Torquay, and Aunt Mabel is as strong as a horse. I thought she was on duty. Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. She was not. She requested the entire afternoon off. Did she by any chance come here? Mrs. Dane shook her head. She telephoned on the Wednesday to say she would be unable to visit on Saturday after all. Something about extra work at the surgery. I was disappointed, of course, but one mustn't complain. Miss Marple inclined her head sympathetically. Of course not. Though it does leave rather a gap between 2:30 and 6 o'clock, does it not? Mrs. Dane looked suddenly distressed. You don't think Gloria is in any trouble? She is such a good girl, sends me money every month, and those lovely pearls she wears came from her own savings, she told me. Miss Marple murmured something soothing and took her leave shortly afterwards, promising to convey Gloria's love. On the return omnibus, she sat very still, gazing out at the wind-tossed trees. No sick aunt, no visit home, a gap of 3.5 hours on the very afternoon Mr. Harbottle died. Back in St. Mary Mead by noon, she paused at the chemist's in the High Street. Mr. Glue, the pharmacist, was serving behind the counter, his sleeves held up with metal bands and his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. Good afternoon, Miss Marple. And what can I do for you today? Your usual lavender water? Not today, Mr. Glue. I am helping Inspector Craddock with a small inquiry. On the 17th, a young lady in a green coat purchased aspirin and a bottle of lavender water at about 3:30. You remarked at the time that she wished to mask the smell of the surgery. Mr. Glue's eyebrows rose like startled caterpillars. Nurse Dane, yes, pretty as a picture. Said the iodine in the dispensary clung to her uniform. Bought 6 aspirin too, said she had a headache coming on. Paid with a crisp 10-shilling note. I remember because I had to give her change in silver and she laughed about being rich for once. Miss Marple thanked him gravely and proceeded to the police station, where Sergeant Lake received her with the mixture of resignation and respect that village constables reserve for gentlewomen who know more than is good for them. Nurse Dane's afternoon off, she began without preamble. I have established that she visited neither aunt nor mother. She was seen in Much Benham at 3:30 buying lavender water to hide a smell, presumably the bitter hay-like scent of fresh foxglove leaves. She had a thermos flask with her initials, and she purchased a stamp she never used. Sergeant Lake whistled. That's damning enough for me. Perhaps, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Yet there is something too neat about it all. The flask left carelessly in the cupboard, the purchases remembered by half the village, the lavish gifts from a man old enough to be her grandfather, It is almost as though someone wishes us to look very hard at Nurse Dane. Lake scratched his head. You think she's being framed. I think someone is being very clever indeed. Tell me, have you discovered anything about Mr. Harbottle's private papers? A will of his own, perhaps? Lake brightened. Funny you should ask. The bank manager telephoned this morning. Mr. Harbottle deposited a new will only last month, sealed with instructions that it be opened only in the event of his death. Inspector Craddock is on his way to collect it now. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Then we may be nearer the end than we think. She left the station and walked slowly homeward, pausing only to buy a quarter of a pound of butter and to exchange polite nothings with Mrs. Price Ridley about the shocking price of coal. At Mead, she found Inspector Craddock waiting on the doorstep, sheltering under the porch with a large buff envelope in his hand. Aunt Jane, you are impossible to track down. Look at this. He led her inside and spread the document on the table. It was a will, properly witnessed, dated the 12th of August. After several small bequests, to Mrs. Polk, to the Cottage Hospital, to the Cats Protection League, the bulk of Mr. Harbottle's estate, some £35,000, was left to my niece Gloria Dane, daughter of my late brother's marriage in Simla, whom I have only recently had the happiness of acknowledging. Miss Marple read it through twice very carefully. So Gloria Dane is Mr. Harbottle's niece, she said at last. Not his fancy, but his legitimate heir. And the Proctor will, if proved genuine, deprives her of everything. Craddock nodded grimly. She must have known he was changing his own will. If the Proctor will stood, she inherited nothing from him. But if Mr. Harbottle died before he could expose the forgery, the Proctor money would come to Clarissa, and Gloria would still have a claim on his estate as next of kin under the old will. Unless, Miss Marple said softly, someone persuaded Mr. Harbottle that the Proctor will was forged and that Clarissa or another was responsible. Then he would naturally disinherit the supposed criminal and leave everything to his newly acknowledged niece. Craddock stared. You mean Gloria forged the Proctor will herself, then murdered her uncle when he discovered it? It is possible, Miss Marple admitted, though I dislike coincidence, and there are still those burnt foxglove leaves in the stove, the thermos, the lavender water, all so very convenient. She folded the new will and handed it back. Dermot, my dear, I think we must look again at the ledger. There was a second ledger, I believe, kept in the safe. Tomorrow is Sunday. On Monday morning, when the office opens, I should like to be present when the safe is unlocked. Craddock smiled. You shall have a front row seat. And if Nurse Dane tries to leave the village in the meantime, Sergeant Lake has instructions to detain her. Miss Marple watched him drive away, then stood at her gate for a long moment, gazing down the quiet lane. The wind had dropped. The first stars pricked out above the rooftops. Somewhere a dog barked once and was silent. A day off that was no day off. A thermos and a scent of lavender. A secret niece and a forged will. The pattern was almost complete. Only one small thread still dangled loose. She went inside, closed the door, and began to prepare a light supper of scrambled eggs and cocoa. Tomorrow would be Sunday. Church, the smell of damp hymnals, the vicar's sermon on the wages of sin. And on Monday, the safe would be opened. Miss Marple smiled a small, determined smile. By Monday evening, she thought, St. Mary Mead would know the truth. And the truth, as she often said, has a habit of being extremely uncomfortable for somebody. Chapter 7. Foxglove summer Sunday dawned with a pale washed sky and the particular hush that settles over English villages when the church bells begin to call the faithful to matins. Miss Marple, in her best dove-gray silk and a hat trimmed with a single velvet pansy, walked the short distance to the ancient parish church of St. Mary the Virgin. The gravel path was still damp from overnight dew. Late roses in the borders gave off a heavy, sweet scent, and the yew trees stood dark and solemn as mourners. Inside, the congregation was larger than usual. Murder, Miss Marple reflected as she slipped into her accustomed pew near the font, has a remarkable effect upon church attendance. Mrs. Price Ridley rustled in black taffeta. Captain Emmett limped to his place with the air of a man who would rather be facing a tiger. Clarissa Proctor, pale and interesting in deep mourning, sat between Mrs. Bantry and a tearful Bunch Harmon. Timothy Wren occupied the choir stalls, looking as though he had not slept for a week. And in the third pew from the back, starched and composed, sat Nurse Gloria Dane, her hymn book held like a shield. The vicar, mercifully unaware of the drama unfolding beneath his nose, chose as his text, Numbers 32:23. Be sure your sin will find you out. The congregation shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Bantry gave a small, satisfied sniff, as though the Church of England had at last justified her worst suspicions. After the service, the churchyard filled with the usual subdued chatter. Miss Marple lingered by the south porch, exchanging polite nothings about the flower rota, while keeping one eye on the dispersing suspects. Mrs. Lavinia Cross, thin and dowdy in rusty black, was arranging bronze chrysanthemums on Mrs. Emmeline Proctor's grave with the air of a woman performing a sacred duty. Miss Marple drifted across the grass and stood quietly beside her. Such beautiful flowers, she murmured. Your aunt was fond of chrysanthemums, I believe. Mrs. Cross started, then managed a tremulous smile. She liked anything that lasted. Roses dropped so quickly. 15 years I looked after her. 15 years, and for what? £500 and that hideous amethyst brooch. Mr. Harbottle said there had been irregularities, that I had been helping myself to the housekeeping money. Her voice cracked. A tear slid down the side of her nose. Miss Marple produced a clean handkerchief. Were you, my dear? Mrs. Cross dabbed fiercely. A few shillings here and there for a new pair of gloves or a theater ticket when I went to town. Nothing significant. But he threatened to tell the police if I didn't. She stopped, pressing her lips together. Didn't what? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Cross glanced round as though the gravestones themselves might be listening. He wanted me to sign a paper saying the new will was genuine, the one that left everything to Clarissa. I refused. I told him I had seen Mrs. Proctor sign the old will, the one that left the money to the cottage hospital, and that the new one was a forgery. He went white as a sheet, said he would deal with it himself. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the grave. The headstone was not yet in place. Only a temporary wooden cross bore the inscription, Emmeline Proctor died, 14th June 1951, aged 78. Beneath the cross lay a small posy of wilted foxgloves, their bells already brown. Foxgloves, Miss Marple said softly, an unusual choice for a grave. Mrs. Cross flushed. Nurse Dane brought them yesterday, said they were Mrs. Proctor's favorite, though I never remember her liking them particularly. Miss Marple bent and picked up one of the withered stems. A few seeds rattled inside the dried pod. Digitalis purpurea, she said. So useful in the proper dose, so fatal in the wrong one. Mrs. Cross gave a little gasp. You don't think I think, Miss Marple said kindly, that you have told me a very great deal more than you intended. And I think you should speak to Inspector Craddock before someone else speaks for you. Mrs. Cross began to cry in earnest, shoulders shaking. Miss Marple patted her arm and moved away, leaving her to the comfort of the chrysanthemums and her own conscience. By the lich gate she encountered Timothy Wren, loitering with the air of a man who has nowhere particular to go. Miss Marple, he began, then stopped, twisting his gloves into knots. I feel I ought to tell someone about the quarrel with Mr. Harbottle. It wasn't about missing files. It was about the Proctor will. He found me studying it late one night and flew into a terrible rage. Said he had reason to believe it was a forgery and that if I had any part in it, he would see me ruined. I swore I knew nothing, but he didn't believe me. Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "And did you know nothing, Mr. Wren?" He flushed crimson. There were discrepancies in the dates. The witnesses were two of the maids who had left service months before the will was supposedly signed. I pointed it out to Mr. Harbottle weeks ago. He said he would investigate quietly. Then suddenly he was dead. A bell began to ring for the 11 o'clock service in the Methodist chapel across the green. Timothy Wren glanced at it desperately. "I think I shall go for a long walk," he said. "I find churches rather oppressive today." Miss Marple watched him stride away, shoulders hunched against the wind that was not there. Then she turned her steps toward the cottage hospital, a neat red brick building on the outskirts of the village where Matron was an old acquaintance. Matron received her in the office with strong coffee and anxious eyes. "We are all dreadfully upset," she confessed. "Mrs. Proctor had promised us £10,000 in her original will. Then the new one left us nothing. And now Mr. Harbottle is dead before anything could be settled. The lawyers say it may be years before probate." Miss Marple sipped her coffee. "And the original will, the one favoring the hospital, where is that kept?" "In the safe at the office, I believe. Mr. Harbottle took it away for comparison. He said there were suspicious signs of erasure on the date." Miss Marple set down her cup. "Thank you, Matron. You have been most helpful." She walked home through the village, her mind moving as briskly as her feet. Mrs. Cross had seen the true will. Timothy Wren had noticed the discrepancies. Nurse Dane had brought foxgloves to the grave as though to remind the dead woman of her change of heart. And somewhere in the office safe lay the duplicate ledger and perhaps the original will itself. Tomorrow was Monday. Tomorrow the office would reopen, the safe would be unlocked, and the truth, or a very near approximation, would be laid bare. Miss Marple paused at her gate. The Michaelmas daisies were over, only the sturdy asters remained, glowing purple against the brick. She bent and cut a small bunch, carrying them indoors to place in a vase on the windowsill. Flowers, she thought, were like people. Some lasted bravely into autumn, others withered at the first frost. And some, foxgloves for instance, were beautiful and deadly in the same breath. She arranged the asters carefully, then sat down with her knitting. The needles clicked steadily. Outside, the church clock struck 1, then 2, then 3. St. Mary Mead dozed in the pale September sunshine, innocent as a child asleep. But Miss Marple was wide awake, and tomorrow, she thought with quiet certainty, the foxgloves would have their reckoning. Chapter 8. The Second Ledger. Monday morning arrived wrapped in thin, pearlescent mist that turned the high street into a watercolor sketch and muffled every footstep. At 9:30 precisely, Miss Marple presented herself at the offices of Harbottle, Finch, and Wren. She wore her neat navy coat, a felt hat with a modest pheasant's feather, and an expression of mild determination that caused Sergeant Lake to open the door without a word. Inside, the air still carried the faint sweetness of chrysanthemums from the funeral wreaths, now wilting in their vases. Timothy Wren stood by the window of the late senior partner's room, pale and hollow-eyed, twisting the office keys in his hands as though they burned him. Inspector Craddock waited beside the large green safe, notebook ready. Dr. Haydock had been summoned in case medical evidence is required, and Mrs. Polk hovered in the doorway, apron clutched to her bosom, unable to decide whether to stay or flee. "Shall we begin?" Craddock asked quietly. Timothy Wren stepped forward, inserted the key with a trembling hand, and swung open the heavy door. Inside lay neat bundles of documents tied with pink tape, a cash box, and 2 leather-bound ledgers. He lifted out the larger one first. "This is the duplicate ledger," he said, voice cracking. "Every transaction is copied into it the same day." Mr. Harbottle was most particular. He laid it on the desk and opened it at the page marked with a paper knife. The entry for the Proctor estate was exactly as it should be. $27,000 to Miss Clarissa Proctor, less duties and fees. Yet in the narrow margin in Mr. Harbottle's unmistakable hand were the words, "See letter in top left drawer." Craddock pulled open the drawer indicated. Inside lay a single sheet of foolscap, folded once. He spread it carefully. It was a draft codicil to the will of Mrs. Emmeline Proctor, dated the 10th of June, 4 days before her death, leaving the entire estate to St. Mary Mead Cottage Hospital, in gratitude for their care of my dear husband in his last illness. The signature line was blank. The document had never been witnessed or executed. Timothy Wren stared at it as though it were a ghost. "I knew nothing of this," he whispered. "Nothing." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Yet someone did. Someone who stood to lose everything if this codicil had been signed." Craddock turned to the second ledger, smaller and bound in maroon cloth. He opened it at random. The pages were blank except for the first 10 or 12. Then at the Proctor entry, a different hand, lighter, more flowing, had written the same figures as in the duplicate, but beneath them in red ink, the single word, "Fraud." Mrs. Polk gave a small squeak. "That's not Mr. Harbottle's writing, nor Mr. Wren's neither." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "It is a woman's hand. Observe the looped Y and the little circle over the I, and the red ink is the same shade as the circle drawn in the public ledger, the circle that was meant to draw our attention to Clarissa." Craddock closed the ledger with a snap. So Harbottle discovered the will was forged, prepared a new codicil to restore the money to the hospital, and someone killed him before he could have it witnessed. "But who knew about the codicil?" Timothy Wren asked desperately. "Only the person who saw it in the drawer, or the person who watched him write it," Miss Marple said. She moved to the window that overlooked the garden. The mist was lifting. The stripped foxgloves stood out starkly against the wall. "Mrs. Polk," she said over her shoulder, "on the day Mr. Harbottle died, did anyone call at the office between luncheon and 3 o'clock?" Mrs. Polk needed no time to think. "Only Nurse Dane. Came to the back door with some papers from Dr. Haydock. Said they were urgent. I showed her into Mr. Harbottle's room because Mr. Wren was out. She was with him no more than 5 minutes. Then she left by the garden. 5 minutes. Time enough to see the codicil, to realize its meaning, to form a plan." Craddock's face was grim. "We have the thermos, the foxglove leaves, the false alibi, the forged letter, and now this. I think, Miss Marple, we have our murderer." Miss Marple did not answer at once. She was looking at the smaller ledger again, at the red word "fraud" written so boldly. "Almost," she said at last. "Almost, Dermot, dear. But there is still one thing that troubles me. The sentence in the public ledger. They think me a fool, I know. It is not the remark of a man who has just discovered a forgery. It is the remark of a man who has been deceived in something far more personal." She turned to Timothy Wren. "Mr. Wren, you told me yesterday that Mr. Harbottle accused you of complicity. Was that the only accusation he made?" The young man went scarlet. He said worse. He said he had proof that I had been speculating with clients' money, small amounts, to cover my gambling losses at the club. He threatened to strike me off. I begged him to give me time. He said he would decide after he had dealt with the Proctor matter." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "So he suspected 2 frauds, one large, one small, and he wrote in the margin that someone, perhaps several someones, thought him a fool." She looked round the quiet room. We have been looking for a single murderer, but murder is sometimes a partnership. Mrs. Polk gave a strangled gasp. Partnership? Like in business? Like in marriage, Miss Marple said gently. Or what was intended to be marriage. Craddock stared. You mean Gloria Dane and Timothy Wren? I mean that a pretty young woman who expects £35,000 from her uncle and a young man facing ruin and disgrace might very easily come to an arrangement. She forges the Proctor will to secure Clarissa's inheritance, perhaps even persuades Clarissa to sign papers without reading them properly. He notices the discrepancies but keeps silent because he has been promised a share or because he is in love. Then Uncle Reginald discovers both deceptions. The codicil would disinherit Clarissa and expose the forgery. The threat to Timothy would destroy his career. Together they decide the old man must die before he can act. Timothy Wren made a small choked sound and sat down heavily on the nearest chair. Craddock stepped forward. Timothy Wren, I must ask you— Wait, Miss Marple raised a hand. There is one final proof, Mrs. Polk. When you found the burnt leaves in the stove, were they wrapped in anything? Mrs. Polk's eyes widened. Why, yes, a sheet of paper, charred, but I could still see writing on it. Looked like figures. I threw it on the fire with the rest, thinking it was rubbish. Miss Marple smiled sadly. A sheet of figures from the small ledger, perhaps. The evidence of Mr. Wren's defalcations. Burnt by the same hand that distilled the foxgloves. She turned to the young man, who was now ashen. It is over, Mr. Wren. The garden has remembered everything. Timothy Wren buried his face in his hands. For a long moment the only sound was the soft tick of the mantel clock, now set to the correct time, and the distant clop of a horse's hooves in the high street. Craddock signaled to Sergeant Lake. We shall need Nurse Dane as well. They can travel together. Miss Marple watched as the two men left, one weeping silently, the other brisk and official. Then she closed the ledgers, laid the unsigned codicil on top, and stood for a moment looking out at the quiet garden. 2 lives ruined for money, she thought, and an old man dead because he had finally found the courage to do what was right. She picked up her umbrella and walked slowly home through the clearing mist. The village looked exactly as it always did, cottage curtains twitching, children playing hopscotch, the smell of Monday washing drifting on the air. Only the foxgloves knew different. Chapter 9. The Drawing Room. Denouement. Tuesday, the 25th of September, arrived with a hard, bright frost that turned every blade of grass into a silver needle and rhymed the thatch on the older cottages. Miss Marple had sent out her invitations the previous evening, small, courteous notes written in her fine, slanting hand. And by 4 o'clock precisely, the sitting room at Mead was filled to capacity. Inspector Craddock stood beside the fireplace, tall and grave. Sergeant Lake guarded the door with the air of a man who has been told no one is to leave until Miss Marple says so. The 5 principal figures sat in a tense semicircle. Clarissa Proctor in pale gray, eyes red-rimmed. Captain Emmett polishing his monocle with unnecessary vigor. Mrs. Lavinia Cross clutching a damp handkerchief. Timothy Wren, haggard and unshaven after a night in the cells. And Nurse Gloria Dane, immaculate in navy with a white collar, hands folded calmly in her lap, and a faint, defiant smile on her lips. Mrs. Bantry, Dr. Haydock, and the vicar's wife had been invited for moral support, which meant they occupied the best chairs and looked thrilled. Miss Marple herself sat very upright in her small armchair, a fresh ball of pale blue wool in her lap, needles resting like crossed swords. Dear friends, she began in her soft, precise voice, Inspector Craddock has kindly allowed me to explain what happened on the afternoon of the 17th. It is always better, I find, when everyone hears the truth at the same time. She paused, letting the silence settle. The murder of Mr. Reginald Harbottle was not a crime of sudden passion, nor even of simple greed. It was a conspiracy, clever, cold, and almost perfect. Almost. We were intended to believe that someone desperate for Mrs. Proctor's £27,000 killed Mr. Harbottle because he had discovered the will was forged. The red circle, the planted letter, the stopped clock, all were designed to point to Miss Clarissa Proctor. But Mr. Harbottle died at 3:20, not 4:20. The clock was advanced 1 hour and 40 minutes to provide alibis for several people. Captain Emmett was at the Goat and Compasses. Miss Proctor was trying on hats. Mrs. Cross was addressing envelopes with Mrs. Clement. Mr. Wren was playing bridge. And Nurse Dane, well, Nurse Dane was supposed to be visiting a non-existent aunt. Yet the true conspiracy was between two people who had everything to lose if Mr. Harbottle lived another day. Gloria Dane lifted her chin. Really, this is absurd. I have already explained. Miss Marple continued as though she had not spoken. Gloria Dane is Mr. Harbottle's niece, his legitimate heir under a will deposited only last month. If the Proctor will stood, she inherited nothing from the Proctor estate, but she would still receive her uncle's 35,000. Timothy Wren, on the other hand, faced ruin. He had been stealing small sums from clients to cover gambling debts, and Mr. Harbottle had discovered it. Between them, they devised a perfect plan. Gloria forged the Proctor will, using stationery stolen from Clarissa's bureau and signatures practiced from old letters. She persuaded Clarissa to sign certain probate papers without reading them carefully. Timothy noticed the discrepancies but kept silent. He had been promised marriage and a share of the money once everything was safe. Then Mr. Harbottle began to suspect. He found the original will leaving everything to the cottage hospital. He prepared a codicil to restore that bequest. Worse, he confronted Timothy about the defalcations. They acted quickly. On the afternoon of the 17th, Gloria visited the office with medical papers as an excuse. She saw the codicil in the drawer, realized the danger, and returned later with a thermos of tea laced with digitalis distilled from foxgloves she had been harvesting all summer. She persuaded her uncle it came from Dr. Haydock to calm his heart. He trusted her. He drank. While he died, she advanced the clock, drew the red circle in the ledger to cast suspicion on Clarissa, tore the forged thank-you letter and left it in the waste paper basket and departed by the garden door at 3:20. She walked to the chemist, bought lavender water to mask the foxglove smell on her hands, and caught the bus, wearing the green coat Mrs. Pauk saw from the window. Timothy's part was simpler. He burned the page from the secret ledger that recorded his thefts, together with the foxglove leaves used for the poison, and waited for the money to become theirs. Timothy Wren made a low, moaning sound and covered his face. Gloria Dane rose slowly, the smile gone. You have no proof. None that would stand in court. Miss Marple opened her reticule and took out a small, charred fragment of paper she had rescued from Mrs. Pauk's stove after Timothy's arrest. This is the corner of a page from the secret ledger. The figures are still legible. 4712/6D taken from the Widows and Orphans Fund. Timothy's handwriting. And wrapped around it were the foxglove leaves. Your fingerprints, Nurse Dane, are on the inner side where the heat did not reach. She laid the fragment on the table. Then there is the thermos, initialed GD, found in the office cupboard. The dregs contain digitalis in lethal concentration. And finally the unsigned codicil, your uncle's last attempt to put right what you had corrupted. Gloria looked round the room as though searching for an escape that was not there. Her gaze fell on Timothy, who would not meet her eyes. It was his idea, she said suddenly, voice sharp. He came to me in a panic, said the old man would ruin him. I only agreed to help because I loved him. Timothy lifted his head. You said we would be rich. You said no one would ever know. Inspector Craddock stepped forward. Gloria Dane, Timothy Wren, I am arresting you both for the murder of Reginald Harbottle and for conspiracy to defraud. The rest was formality. Sergeant Lake took Gloria's arm. She did not resist. Timothy allowed himself to be led away like a man in a dream. Clarissa Proctor began to cry quietly into Mrs. Bantry's ample shoulder. Captain Emmett cleared his throat several times and stared hard at the carpet. When the door closed behind the prisoners, the room seemed suddenly larger. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. Such a pity, she said gently. They were both clever in their way. But cleverness without conscience is a dangerous thing. Mrs. Bantry dabbed her eyes. And the money? The hospital will have it all once the proper will is proved. Mrs. Cross's small peculations will be repaid quietly. And Clarissa, poor child, will have her theater after all, though on a more modest scale. Dr. Haydock raised his glass of sherry. Someone had produced a decanter in the excitement. To Miss Marple, who sees what the rest of us miss. Miss Marple shook her head. I only see what is there, doctor dear. Human nature is really very simple. One has only to know where to look. Outside, the frost was beginning to melt under a pale, reluctant sun. St. Mary Mead would talk of nothing else for months, and the foxgloves in every garden would be regarded with new respect. But in Danemead the fire crackled cozily. Alexander the Great purred on the hearthrug, and Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily on. Another pattern completed. Chapter 10. Resolution and Explanation over Morning Tea. A week had passed since the arrests, and St. Mary Mead had settled back into its accustomed rhythms with the resilience of a village that had seen its share of scandals, but preferred to forget them over cups of tea and plates of buttered crumpets. The frost had given way to a mild Indian summer. Golden light filtered through the leaves, and the air carried the faint, nostalgic scent of bonfires. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table in Danemead, buttering a slice of wholemeal toast with precise movements. Her small blue eyes resting on the garden where the last asters bloomed defiantly against the approach of autumn. The doorbell chimed softly, and Miss Knight, her companion who had returned from a short holiday in Bournemouth, ushered in Inspector Dermot Craddock. He looked less harassed than he had the previous Tuesday, though there were still shadows under his eyes from the paperwork and interviews that inevitably followed a double arrest. Aunt Jane, he greeted her, bending to kiss her cheek. I thought you might like a final report over coffee, real coffee, if you have it. Miss Marple smiled and rang the little silver bell for Miss Knight. Of course, Dermot dear, and perhaps a slice of walnut cake. You look as though you haven't eaten properly for days. They settled at the table by the window, the coffee steaming fragrantly between them. Outside, the postman waved cheerfully as he passed. A blackbird sang from the apple tree as though all the wickedness in the world had been banished with the morning mist. She has confessed everything, Craddock began, stirring his coffee with a silver spoon. Gloria Dane, or Gloria Harbottle, as we now know her. The forgery was her idea from the start. She had discovered her uncle's old letters from Simla and confronted him privately 6 months ago. He acknowledged her, promised to make her his heir, but kept it secret for fear of scandal. Then Mrs. Proctor fell ill, and Gloria saw her chance. As the nurse attending her, she had access to the house, the bureau, the old will. She forged the new one, substituting Clarissa's name as sole beneficiary, and persuaded the old lady to sign it in a moment of confusion. Mrs. Proctor's mind was wandering near the end. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, spreading marmalade on her toast. And Timothy Wren, he was drawn in later, I suppose. Exactly. Gloria confided in him when they became engaged, secretly, of course. He was already in trouble with his gambling. The promise of money was too tempting. He agreed to overlook the discrepancies in the will when it came through the office. But Mr. Harbottle, being the meticulous man he was, began to suspect. He found the original will in the safe, noticed the erasures, and confronted Timothy. Then he prepared the codicil to restore the estate to the hospital. Craddock paused to sip his coffee. Poor old Harbottle. He wrote that note in the ledger. "They think me a fool, I know." After Gloria's first visit that afternoon. He had guessed she was involved in the forgery, perhaps even suspected Timothy. But he trusted her enough to drink the tea she brought back later, disguised as a prescription. "From Dr. Haydock?" Miss Marple set down her knife. "Trust is such a fragile thing, Dermot, and love, well, love can blind even the cleverest." Gloria thought she could have it all. Her uncle's money, the Proctor fortune through Clarissa's unwitting complicity, and a husband to share it with. But when Harbottle prepared the codicil, everything unraveled. Craddock leaned back, crossing his legs. Timothy's confession filled in the rest. He burned the ledger page with his thefts after Gloria left, thinking it would destroy the evidence against him. But he didn't notice the charred corner that fell behind the grate. And the foxglove leaves. Gloria had been distilling them in the surgery dispensary for weeks, under the guise of making herbal remedies. She left the thermos in the cupboard deliberately to make it seem careless rather than calculated. Miss Marple poured more coffee, the pot steady in her small hands. And the alibis? The clock advanced so cleverly. A joint effort. Gloria advanced it before leaving. Timothy confirmed it when he discovered the body with Mrs. Polk. They counted on the village assuming death at 4:20, when both had ironclad alibis. But Dr. Haydock's examination showed the true time, and the rest followed. The lavender water to mask the scent, the planted letter to implicate Clarissa, the red circle to point to the will. She glanced out of the window where the village went peacefully about its business. Children skipping home from school, Mrs. Baker sweeping her step, the vicar cycling past with a wave. "Such a pleasant place, St. Mary Mead," she murmured. "One quite forgets how much wickedness can hide behind a well-polished front door. Poor Mrs. Cross, her little embezzlements will be repaid quietly, I trust, and the hospital will have its money now that the original will stand." Craddock nodded. "Yes, and Clarissa is cleared. She'll receive a small legacy from her aunt's genuine bequests, enough to start her theater venture modestly. Captain Emmett has paid his debts with a timely win at the races. Life goes on." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "As it must. Though I dare say Gloria and Timothy will have ample time to reflect in prison. Conspiracy to murder is not taken lightly." Craddock set down his cup. "Without you, Aunt Jane, we might have arrested Clarissa and let the real culprits walk free." "How did you see it so clearly?" She waved a deprecatory hand, butter knife glinting in the light. "Only observation, my dear, and a little knowledge of human nature. People are so much like villages, full of secrets, but the clues are always there if one looks beyond the net curtains. The stripped foxgloves, the burnt leaves, the two perfect alibis, they told their own story." He rose, hat in hand. "Well, I must be off. Reports to file, superiors to appease, but thank you. Again." Miss Marple saw him to the door, watching as he strode down the path, tall and purposeful. Then she returned to the table, poured herself a final cup of coffee, and picked up her knitting. The needles resumed their soft, rhythmic click. Alexander the Great jumped onto the windowsill, tail twitching as he watched a sparrow in the garden. Miss Marple stroked his head absently. "Another knot unraveled," she said to the cat, "though there will always be more wool to wind." Outside, the church clock struck 11, its chimes clear and true. St. Mary Mead basked in the autumn sun, secrets safely buried once more. But Miss Jane Marple knew better. In every quiet corner and every polite smile, the potential for mischief lingered. It was, after all, only human nature. And human nature, as she often reflected, was the most fascinating puzzle of all.